Welcome.
Hello, hi. Yeah, thanks. I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good. Fine too. So we have still some minutes to go.
Yeah, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure because I was online first, and then I couldn't see my video and audio, so I was worrying that
So everything is prepared. Your PowerPoint and
yes, it's all ready. It's all ready to go. I'll just.
I guess also so slowly our participants are joining us.
How many do we have registered?
Oh, I think we are around 30 at the moment.
13?
No, 30.
30. Wow.
25, 30. I just had a quick look at it.
Excellent.
I guess Hannah will give me an update during the webinar.
Wonderful.
So yesterday I joined the webinar with there was an interview with one of our top diplomats here, Vigand, who is the director of the Asia Pacific department. And in this interview, he got described as a digital diplomat, and we are turning now into digital academics, it seems.
Yeah.
So how do you feel as a digital academic?
Well, I mean, actually, I work in a university whose mission and vocation are really the ones of online teaching and distance learning. Okay. So to an extent, I'm getting used to it because I've joined only in October last year before working at the normal Red Brick University, right? So I'm getting into the character, but still, it still feels a bit. I think it's still a bit weird because I much rather enjoyed the especially in this context the interaction, the live present. Yeah, exactly. So and that would have been a good chance to meet again in person. But I mean, hopefully soon.
Yeah. So are you getting, I guess, a lot of requests for webinars now?
Yeah.
Let's get really started now. It seems this is a new way to do everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's gonna be, especially because here the latest news is that the lockdown is gonna be until June, but then social distancing probably even farther. So I mean, let's see what happens, but probably the online, it's really the only option to get things going. So
yeah,
we'll see.
I think that's also an advantage. You can organize happening events with people from other continents, and it's really a wonderful opportunity. On one
it is.
There's one side is a distancing, but on the other side, the world comes closer again, even more closer.
And also, that's very true. And I mean, we've had also in terms of how my department works. I feel that since the lockdown started, there has been more of a sense of community than there was before. So we tend to get together a bit more often just to check how people are. So. Of course, it's far from an ideal situation, but there are some positive things which are coming out of it. So it's.
Yeah, I mean, one of the positive things, I mean, from my experience from Heidelberg University, you have now much more opportunities to join debates, which were before not behind closed doors, but it was just not possible to join because of time, because of budgets and restrictions. So now,
absolutely.
At least a budget restriction and you save time with traveling, and it gives you much more opportunities.
That's very
true. To interact.
True. That's very true.
You can suddenly join a conference or a roundtable discussion from Islamabad to Beijing to New Delhi.
Yeah.
Which was before just not possible.
Yeah, I mean, and also the idea of just flying to the other side. I mean, one of the things that I'm still not particularly enthusiastic about the academic world is the fact that you have to fly to the other side of the world to give a 15 minutes to give a 15 minutes presentation, right?
Yes,
so big conference like the International Studies Association this year was supposed to be in the Hawaii. I mean, amazing. excellent. You attach a week to the presentation, you're on annual leave, that's fantastic. But if you think about the actual purpose of why you're going there, it makes no sense.
Yeah, one started to question cost benefit. Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. One thing is for me, London Brussels, it's a train, and it's easy to do. It's quick, relatively quick. You can do it on the day. But if you have to fly to the other, and it's an event which is 45 minutes Q&A, so there's a purpose to it. But 15 minutes with other 4,000 people and no one notices even you're there, I don't know. I think it's gonna get reconsidered as things.
Yeah, that's definitely one of our advantages which we get now out of the situation.
Absolutely.
So we are still waiting, I guess, a couple of minutes. So it's 15,
yeah, that's fine.
So we have 2-3 minutes more to go. I guess most of the people were already here. So yeah.
I was reading your book past couple of weeks, and I thought it was excellent. It was very, very good.
Thank you very much for your kind words.
Yeah. It's a much needed contribution.
Perhaps we'll have a lot of opportunity. I think we have a lot of overlap in our works in this direction.
Yeah, I was very pleased to see that that there are a lot of things that we share, especially on the approach, and something I will mention on today's talk. So, but especially the conceptualization of economic corridors that you've done, I think that's very interesting. And there's a lot of talk about what these economic corridors are, but very little analysis. So that's really, really good.
Yeah, it's really not the conversation of today. When the conceptual work of our economic corridor, but this was, it's often the case in social science that people are talking about ideas, concepts, but without defining it. And this was a problem that we had with the China-Pakistan economic corridor at the beginning, as you know. Everybody was talking about economic corridors, but not many had really a vision, a clear concept. What should be economic corridor about? And this is really crucial when it comes to assessing the performance.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I remember this was also something you've presented when we first met in Paris, right? That was the sort of the broader framework of your presentation there. So it was very good.
Yes. So we have started to figure out one technical aspect of it. So we don't stick to our academic rules with the academic quarter. I think we should slowly start when you are prepared, Filippo. So good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to our SADF webinar. As you might see from the window, my name is Siegfried Wolf, and I'm the Director of Research at the South Asia Democratic Forum. As many of you know, I'm also working from home to practice a well-known social distancing, a word which I think is a bit of a misnomer. I would rather prefer a term like physical distancing. That we are still able to have social interaction, at least in a digital way, can be seen proved as a fact that we are actually talking to each other at the moment. So we are still there, so social active. So as in this context, I don't think we are social distancing. But however, we are following all the rules. Today's webinar is the second one organized by SADF. After we discussed earlier this week with Professor Dr. Amitendu Palit from the National University of Singapore's impacts of the coronavirus in India. But today we will shift our focus towards India's western neighborhood. More concretely, we will talk about the political dynamics in Pakistan, its relation with China, the role of the military in the country, and we will shed some light on the country's role in the regional context. Everybody who is a bit familiar with Pakistan is aware that its relations with China is for sure one of the main angles and fixed points of its foreign policy, besides, of course, the relation with India and Afghanistan, and is of utmost important significance for the decision makers in Islamabad. From my perspective, there's a common sense that since several years, the Sino-Pakistan relation is at the peak due to the so-called China Belt and Road Initiative, in which Pakistan is a core pillar, in particular since it is host of the so-called China-Pakistan corridor, which is called in brief the CPEC, which is often described as the flagship project of the Belt and Road. This CPEC can be seen as a kind of engine for the contemporary Sino-Pakistan relations and is touching many dimensions of the bilateral interaction for Islamabad and Beijing. As such, we will have a lot of discuss today. But like everything else in these days, also the China-Pakistan relation and the CPEC and everything that is related to these issues are impacted by the corona crisis, and I'm pretty sure we will touch this issue too today. In order to understand better the current dynamics in Pakistan, I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker, Filippo Boni. I know Filippo since several years, since we share similar research interests and discussing our works on many occasions on conferences, and of course now in the online way via our webinar. Filippo is a lecturer in international studies and politics at the Open University. The Open University can be seen as the largest public university, not only in the UK, but also in the whole of Europe. He recently authored a book in the context of our today's conversation and is a co-editor of the Asia Maya, is Italy's leading academic publication on Asia current affairs. Besides this, he is well known for his publication and sharing his research findings in leading academic journals. And before I hand over the word to you, Filippo, I just have to do two administrative announcements. First of all, after the presentation, there will be the opportunity to take part in a Q&A session. And therefore, you have the opportunity during the presentation to write down your answer. There's a specific button you can use. Please don't forget to mention your full name, or your name and of course your affiliation. And the second announcement, which I have the pleasure to do, is that our next webinar is also already in the pipeline and will be held on May 6th with Dr. Faisal Defchi from the University of Oxford, and he will share his views on the state of the art or in India-China relations. But from now on, I don't want to delay our debate much more longer and hand over the floor or the channel to our speaker, Filippo. Filippo, the word is with you.
Thank you so much, Siegfried. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, wonderful.
All good? Perfect. Excellent. So so much, Wilfried, for the very kind and warm introduction. And to you and the South Asia Democracy Forum for hosting this event. I wish next time we have the chance to do this in person, but as given the current circumstances, it's great that we're still able to meet even if virtually. Well, thanks to Hannah and the Shika for supporting and making sure that this is going on smoothly as well. I'll start with the screen share. Share screen. I'll start with the presentation. Okay, can you see it?
Yeah, it's working.
Okay, perfect. Done. Excellent. So today's talk really focuses on a subject and on a topic that I've been studying and working on since 2013, and that has evolved at a very rapid pace over the past few years. And I mean, the ramifications of Pakistani relations have at the local, regional, as well as global levels. So I think it's very, it's quite a good time to discuss China-Pakistan relations now. Just to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about in the presentation, after a brief introduction, I will sort of outline why it's important to do this and outline a little bit more the relevance of the topic. I will then move on to this to outline very briefly the structure, framework, and methods informed the analysis of the book, and which forms the main bulk of some of the content, the analysis, and the empirical findings we'll hear in today's presentation. I will then move on to sort of provide a brief background of how the relationship has evolved in the last 20 years. And this, I think, it's particularly important because it helps us contextualize how some of the dynamics that we see unfolding in today's CPEC debate actually ground their roots in the early 2000s. And then I will look at the domestic and regional dynamics of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which will form the main bulk of the sort of empirical analysis that I will present today, and before drawing some final conclusions. So, Sino-Pakistani relations, it's really a topic which appeals to a wide range of different audiences, and it has been at the heart of media, policy, and academic debates in the past few years. An example of this, this is a headline from an article which appeared in last month, which was essentially not criticizing, but reporting how the economic corridor was not particularly going on at a rapid pace, which, as I will show in the later parts of the presentation, I think it's an unfair characterization, but it was something which was in the news. Beyond the sort of more specific level of Gwadar and CPEC, I think Pakistan has, in recent years, and especially in the past couple of years, one of the key flashpoints in which the US-China global competition has really unfolded and played out. And this was very much the case when last year, at the end of last year, we've heard the remarks made by the Ambassador Ali Wells on the China-Pakistan economic corridor, in which was essentially criticizing, the project and sort of allowing to emerge some of the critical points related to the depth that the project would bring, the employment opportunities. So she was portraying a rather negative and gloomy picture of the economic corridor. And this was immediately rejected, of course, by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, the Pakistani Foreign Ministry, but I think it gives us an indication of how important Pakistan is also in wider trends, in wider global trends. And finally, there was a very interesting article which was published recently rather than an article, it was more a viewpoint, a research note, questioning Pakistan's decision to adhere to the Belt and Road Initiative, to be one of its chief enthusiasts, and in general, it was sort of questioning Pakistan's decision to align its foreign policy ever closely to China. So what this brief overview demonstrates is that the debate is really multi-layered, and it touches a number of different areas that I will also try to sort of sketch out in today's presentation. But before we move on to the more empirical parts of the discussion, I think it's important to set out the approach that I take, both in the book and in general in my research on China-Pakistan relations. I look at it mostly from the prism of Pakistan's domestic politics, and as well as civil-military relations, which is an integral and key component of it. And this is for a number of reasons. First of all, because I think that especially since the BRI has been announced in 2013 by the now very famous speech by President Xi Jinping at Nazarbayev University, I think that the relationship between Pakistan and China now really transcend the exclusive diplomatic foreign policy dimension that it used to have previously. And it extends into areas and expands into a wide range of areas that have policy relevance within Pakistan. And this is something which will be reflected also in the structure of the book and in the presentation. So I think it would be reductive in a way to confine Pakistan-China relation to the foreign policy dimension. The second aspect, which I think it's important emphasizing as well, is that since the advent of the BRI, Pakistan, but in general, I think this applies to most of the countries which are part of the Belt and Road Initiative, these countries have been mostly portrayed as passive recipients of Chinese investments, thereby neglecting the complex realities on the ground and how local stakeholders interact with their Chinese counterparts, whether it's governments, whether it's state-owned enterprises, and so on and so forth. So I think that this complexity of the way in which the BRI is implemented is important, and that's why looking at the domestic politics, it's a key aspect. The third one is that I think that this approach helps to bring to the fore, again, the domestic political context and to look at how these projects have also been internalized in the countries. So, and how in this case, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, for instance, has become a key component in the public political debates. We read about CPEC almost every day, whether new projects are announced, whether the negotiations on some aspects are going ahead or not. So it has really become a key part of the public debate in Pakistan. And I think that by looking at this dimension, we get a better sense of how things may unfold also in other parts of the BRI. So with regards to the structure, framework, and methods, very briefly, the book is organized around three main case studies: the port of Gwadar, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and Sino-Pakistani relations in Afghanistan. And I analyzed these three case studies through a period of time which spans from 2000 to 2018, so really in the 21st century. There's also an historical background chapter which contextualizes these dynamics a bit more historically, but the main bulk of the empirical discussion is focused on these three areas in the 20 years. And what I've done for each of these case studies, I've looked at 4 decision-making areas. So economic policy, elite recruitment, internal security, and foreign policy. And I've sort of assessed the level of military influence in each of these decision-making areas. And this draws on the sort of Heidelberg model of civilian control that Siegfried knows very well, since he was one of the he was part of this conceptualization. So this is the main approach I take. And in terms of the methodology, it's based on semi-structured elite interviews that I've conducted in Pakistan between 2015 and 2018, with some follow-up interviews, email interviews done in early 2019. Of course, triangulated with primary, secondary sources. So this is just to give you an overview of what the book looks like. And today I'm going to focus more on the Pakistan economic corridor and a little bit as well on the Sino Pakistani relations with Afghanistan, as I think that that's also something quite timely and which could generate some discussion in the Q&A as well. So China-Pakistan relations. Why do I want to start in the early 2000s? First of all, because I think that here we find the origin of some of the trends that really characterize the relationship today. First of all, in 2001, we see the beginning of the first phase of development of the port of Gwadar, which is the starting point of the China-Pakistan economic corridor and is located in Pakistan, Pakistan's Balochistan. The first phase was completed in 2006, and what I think interesting to notice here, because it resembles what we see today, is that the financing of this first phase of PICs was done through grants, Chinese grants, which is what's going on pretty much at the moment in Gwadar. So the main form of financing of projects in the area is through grants. The port was then handed over to the Port of Singapore Authority in 2008, and then back to the China Overseas Port Holding Corporation in 2013, and since then there has been more going on. So the first trend is the way in which the development in Gwadar has been financed, which started in the early 2000s and has become very much in the news, as the Bloomberg headline that I've showed at the beginning demonstrates. The second point is that discussion about the economic corridor really start taking shape in the early 2000s under President Musharraf's rule. And the idea was to sort of make the most out of Pakistan's geographic location and to use this location to be a sort of bridge for China to the rich states. At the same time, in Pakistan's view, one of the key criteria behind proposing the development of a corridor was to open up the Central Asian markets as well. And it's something I will return to also in the later parts of the presentation. And these preparations really continued on the PPP government, but then really saw the light and came alive, became live in the post-2013 period. So the second trend, again, is the economic corridor. And the third one is the signing of the free trade agreement in 2006. The second piece has become effective since the 1st of January 2020. So this is another important aspect, which I think it's worth mentioning here. Really, it's the moment when the relationship starts embracing also the economic component. So to sort of summarize China-Pakistan relations in a couple of graphs, I think that these two charts give us an indication of what the relationship has looked like in recent years. The first one are the arms exports to Pakistan from China and the US, the two major arms suppliers to Pakistan. And we see that since 2011, China's been the major arm, which is the red box in the top in the chart at the slide. China's been the major arms supplier to Pakistan, whereas at the bottom you see the trade balance that Pakistan has with China and the US. And you can clearly see that since the BRI started, the trade balance has been, the negative trade balance has really opened up. The gap has really opened up. So essentially what we see here is that the backbone of the partnership has been the military dimension, whereas the economic component has been added to it later and progressively, with all the implication that this has had, because as we see here, the trade balance, it's tilted in China's favor. While this is not unique to China-Pakistan relations, I think it's an aspect which is worth emphasizing. So why am I looking at CPEC? Because first of all, CPEC has become, it has become impossible since 2013 almost to decouple China-Pakistan relations from the China-Pakistan corridor. Most of the discussion which was going on lateral level, whether it was high-profile visits, whether it was in joint working groups, has been almost entirely related to the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So I think that's really an interesting starting point and an ideal springboard to look at China-Pakistan relations today. This is a picture which I quite like, as it shows the preparations for the very momentous the visit by Chinese President Xi Jinping to Pakistan in April 2015, which officially launched the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Some of the MOUs, memorandums of understanding related to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, were already signed in 2013, but the visit of the Chinese president, it's really taken as the starting point and the official launch of the initiative. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, if we wanted to sort of capture it in two pictures, I think these are the main ones that we can identify. The first one is the Port Qasim power plant, which is one of the early harvest projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. And the second one is a picture that I took of the orange line from below the orange line in Lahore. So really, infrastructure energy projects were the main bulk of the first phase of CPEC. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, as most of us probably already know, it was defined by Li Keqiang, the Chinese premier, as the flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative. Numbers as to the total amount of investment have gone incredibly since it was originally announced as a 46 billion. They were in 2015. It then moved up to 62 billion in 2017. In fact, what we see, and according to the data which has been provided also that it's available, it's openly available on the Planning Commission's website, is that we have around 20 billion of projects which have been either completed or are under construction. And as I've mentioned at the beginning, the lion's share of the projects is on energy and infrastructure. So what I will do now is sort of try and look at the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor through the lens of Pakistan's domestic politics across the four areas that I've mentioned. So economic policy, elite recruitment, internal security, and foreign policy. To try and make sense of how the politics behind the corridor have worked. So economic policy, it's a very interesting point to start with. First of all, it was the economic coordination between China and Pakistan over CPEC, it's very institutionalized. And it's one of the most institutionalized frameworks that China has developed across the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's mostly done through the Joint Cooperation Committee, which is the chief coordination body between China and Pakistan. On the Pakistani side, it's the Minister of Planning, Development and Reform. It's the representative, whereas on the Chinese side, it's the National Development and Reform Commission. And it's organized with joint working groups, each addressing specific areas, whether it's industrial cooperation, development of special economic zones, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a very interesting and important point that we need to emphasize. At the same time, what I think is also very important is to look at the politics behind all this, and how the control over the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor has been really at the heart of disagreements between civilian and military authorities. And this was especially the case under the PMLN government, the one that was in power between 2013 and 2018. And the debate here and the positions were quite polarized. On the one, there was the desire of the military to have some greater control over the projects, which of course contrasted with the desire, with the PMLN's will to retain its way over the decision-making process. What we've seen is that since 2018, after the elections and the victory in the elections of the PTI government, what we've seen has been a progressive dilution of the civilian control that to an extent was established under the PMLN, with the establishment of the CPEC authority and the creation of the National Development Council, especially the CPEC authority. I think it's an interesting case because it was initially proposed under the PMLN, who rejected the idea for the very reason that they wanted to sort of, they didn't want to give the military greater control, but then it came to life under the PTI government in early 2019, and it's headed by a retired military official. So I think as far as economic policy is concerned, so I think it's interesting to show how this trend and the politics behind it evolved in the past 5 to 6 years. As far as elite recruitment is concerned, so I think key institutions and agencies, Joint Cooperation Committee that I've mentioned at the beginning, the National Highway Authority, which is one of the main agencies tasked with the implementation of CPEC, have at the helm civilian officials. But at the same time, what we've seen and what I've just mentioned also is that the CPEC authority is headed by a retired military official. And at the same time, overall, the narrative of CPEC's advancement and protection has been mostly brought forward by the military, especially in the past couple of years. So what we've seen is that a number of statements and headlines that we've read were about, protecting and going ahead with CPEC at all costs, and these were mostly coming from military officials. This doesn't necessarily mean that the two sides are not on the same page as far as CPEC is concerned, but there was one side of the civil-military relations which was more vocal on this. Another aspect, another decision-making area, which it's very interesting to look at, it's internal security. And internal security has a number of components. First of all, the land and maritime component. On the land side, we've seen the establishment of a special security division consisting of roughly 15,000 men. There have been discussions recently about raising another division to ensure security of Chinese projects in the country. On the maritime side, I think it's very interesting to see how the Pakistani Navy established a number of forces to protect the port of Gwadar and the coastal area. This is the case with the Task Force 88, which aims to protect from seaward threats, the Force Protection Battalion, which is a segment of the Pakistan Marines who's stationed in Gwadar, and the Coastal Security and Harbor Defense Force, which protects the activities along the coastal area. Another interesting aspect, it's the use of private security contractors. This is done to an extent through some joint ventures, because foreign private security companies are really not, are banned from operating in Pakistan. So that's the way in which it's working. There is also, I think, a digital component to the internal security of CPEC, and the fiber optic cable, which has been developed as part of the early harvest projects, has been developed by the Special Communications Organizations, which is another organization headed by a military official. Sorry. Finally, there has been discussions about developing smart cities projects with Chinese technology as a way to ensure safety in urban areas within Pakistan. So to sort of conclude this whistle-stop tour of the decision-making process behind CPEC, I think we cannot avoid discussing a bit of CPEC and Pakistan's federalism. Some of the findings, the findings that I'm presenting here are discussed both in the book and also in a forthcoming article which I've co-authored with Professor Catherine Adeney at the University of Nottingham. This is the map of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And what we've seen is that the early harvest projects, so the ones that were prioritized in this first phase, were mostly developed along the eastern route, which is the red line that you see, that you can hopefully see on the map here. This means that most projects, especially energy ones, are concentrated in Sindh and Punjab. And they are the ones that have also been completed first. So it's not just the number of projects that have been allocated to each province, it's also the rate of completion. And while this can be explained partly by the fact that coal power plants are relatively quicker to complete than hydroelectric ones, which are the ones which are being built in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, for instance, I think that there was an element of prioritization in this case of the eastern route over the western route. Why was this the case? Again, here, the politics behind BRI projects and the domestic politics especially. One potential explanation that was put forward was that the PMLN space was mostly in Punjab, and Punjab returns also the majority of seats to the National Assembly. So I think that's one possible explanation, combined with China's desire to work on areas of Pakistan that were already developed. So Sindh and Punjab are relatively more industrialized than, of course, Balochistan and KP. So China's desire to work on this area, and this is something which emerged quite clearly from the interviews that I've done during fieldwork. So we'll move on now to the foreign policy and the regional dimension of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And one of the things which I think it's important before we dive into in a cursory survey of the regional dynamics, I think it's important to look at what does it mean for an economic corridor to work in a regional context. So the Asian Development Bank has clearly said and clearly stated that for economic corridors to function, they need to be integrated in the regional transportation networks. And there has to be regional connectivities for this to really tap and fulfill their full potential. So as they clearly state, the economic corridors really do not function in isolation. So to what extent can we say that CPEC is integrated in its region? And if we look around, if we look at the regional dynamics, what are the prospects for the full development of this? Okay, if we start from, of course, India and the China-Pakistan economic corridor, India has objections to CPEC on mostly 3 grounds. The first one is a sovereignty issue. India claims that the China-Pakistan economic corridor goes through Gilgit-Baltistan, which is part of the wider Kashmir issue. And I mean, this is one of the key concerns that was also raised by the former foreign minister of India, Jaishankar, in 2018 when he visited Beijing. The second one is that India fears that Gwadar as a potential military base, the potential for Gwadar to become a military base, and they also fear that the long-standing partnership between China and Pakistan has represented a constant concern for India. And I'd be happy to discuss a little bit more about this if you want in the Q&A. And overall, policymakers in New Delhi see the China-Pakistan economic corridor as a counterbalance to India's regional influence, not least in Afghanistan, which is the focus of the next slide. The way in which Sino-Pakistani relations in Afghanistan, I think, has seen a bit of a shift, especially since 2014, when we've seen a renewed diplomatic push from Beijing as far as Afghanistan is concerned. And this renewed diplomatic push really took the form and the shape of a number of institutional settings, which invariably included Pakistan. Whether it was hosting the Heart of Asia Istanbul process in 2014, or appointing a special envoy to Afghanistan, or establishing a consultation mechanism at the foreign ministers level, including China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, as a way to mediate and trying to mend fences between the two countries. So what we've seen is that China has been increasingly more active in the Afghan scenario. However, this has not necessarily translated into Pakistan-Afghanistan relations improving in any particular sense, as they are more or less following the sort of same trajectory of tensions and mistrust that have characterized their bilateral ties since the very inception. for this reason, while there are discussions about, extending CPEC regionally, and Afghanistan would be a natural corridor, if you like, to access Central Asian markets, I think that unless the political conditions, unless the political will is there, it's difficult to see an extension of CPEC to Afghanistan, at least under the present circumstances. What I think it's also another interesting aspect of the regional dimension that we should look at is the sort of renewed ties between Russia and Pakistan. This is not to claim that it has happened a result of CPEC, not at all. It's a rapprochement which actually started in 2011. It's something which then developed again as a defense agreement in 2014. But what we've seen in recent years is that there have been joint military exercises, DRUSPA, which, if I'm not wrong, means friendship. And there have been in 2016, 2017, and now they've become yearly military exercises. There have been some high-profile, high-level exchanges with former foreign minister that visited Moscow in February 2018. The chief of army staff went in April 2018 as well. So high-profile bilateral interactions, which have mostly been led by the military dimension. But what is also interesting to see is that in December 2019, a 64-member business delegation from Russia visited Pakistan. While not all of the details have been revealed about the visit, I think that there are two aspects which are interesting, which is worth emphasizing. The first one is that there have been discussions about the North-South pipeline project. This is, according to recent reports as well, this is also going ahead. And China and Russia has promised to build a railway track from Quetta to Taftan. So this is not to say that the relationship it's fully developed, but I think it's an interesting trend that we should follow as a result of this wider regional engagement and realignment. So to wrap up and to sort of provide some general conclusions. What should we expect for CPEC in the way ahead? And what about China-Pakistan relations? First of all, CPEC first. What we've seen is that despite some pushback in the official narrative, some of the projects have slowed down in recent months. This is in part because, of course, of the pandemic and COVID-19, but also because difficulties in agreeing on the way forward. What we've seen now is that there is less focus on mega projects. The ninth Joint Cooperation Committee, the ninth meeting of the Joint Cooperation Committee in Islamabad at the end of November, at the end of 2019, did not agree on any substantive new projects included. It was mostly focused on consolidating the ones that are already in motion and under construction. And what we've seen has been a distinct focus on more small-scale social development projects, as opposed to the mega infrastructural and energy ones that we've seen in the previous phase. And what I think is also an interesting trend that we need to assess is that the establishment of the CPEC authority is a sign of a couple of things. First of all, the strategic importance of CPEC and dilution of civilian control over the project. And that's pretty clear by the fact that it's headed by a 3-star general of the Pakistani army, a retired. And it's also an indication that, to an extent, there are some pressures to deliver on the implementation of these projects. Not least because there have been in the news some reports that President Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, was supposed to visit Pakistan at some point this year to mark 5 years after his first visit in 2015, which, as I've mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, launched the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So there is clearly a desire there to push things forward in order to showcase what's been done. And it's not just the Pakistan-only aspect, but it would showcase to the world as well that the BRI has been working and has been delivering projects on the ground in one of the key areas, such as Pakistan. So in general, as far as Pakistan-China relations are concerned, what I think it's clear now is that, especially since 2018, political agendas are less aligned now than they were under the PMLN government. There have been some frictions, there have been some sort of, they had to find a way to move things forward in a different way that used to be under the PMLN government. That this means that there is, that there are issues, not particularly. I think that the fundamentals of the relationship are always quite solid. An example of this is the Pakistani president's visit to Beijing last month in the middle of the pandemic, which was a clear indication of solidarity from Pakistan to China. As part of the delegation, there was the Minister for Planning and Development, who was there to discuss and move CPEC forward as well. So there was a component of CPEC clearly in this visit. And in general, defense cooperation, it still forms the backbone of Sino-Pakistani ties, and it's still well on track. So overall, I think that in the first couple of years of the PTI government, there have been some frictions to an extent on how to move things forward. But on the overall, I think that the relationship, it's still, as Siegfried was mentioning in his introduction, probably one of the highest peaks that we've seen in the historical trajectory. So I think I will stop here, and thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, Filippo, thank you very much for your very interesting, insightful presentation, and that you shared with us your latest research finding on such an important, crucial topic for us. From my own experience, from my own work, I have to congratulate you that to summarize such a comprehensive topic. I know how difficult it is to give in such a short time presentation on such a multi-dimensional, multifaceted topic. So a lot of thanks that you were able to really give us comprehensive overview on various topics. I have many questions, but I try to hold myself a bit back. Otherwise, I get alert to hold a second presentation. But the idea of the webinar is, of course, to give our participant the floor. I have already several questions here, and we just start with the first one. The first question comes from our director of SADF, Paulo Casaca. He has the question in the context of the GSP Plus. Yeah? As many of us know that the European Union has the GSP Plus instrument to grant certain countries trade preferences to import tax-free goods into the European Union. And Paulo is asking in this context if you might think if this is not a way, this granting of GSP Plus to Pakistan, for China to use the CPEC as a mechanism to get better position in trade, to strengthen its trading position in Europe. What is your thoughts on that? Take your time. I know it's a very complex.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the trade dimension, and I think that's a particularly interesting one. It's potentially a way. It's potentially a way to strengthen its trading position with Europe. What I think we've seen in the second phase, and it goes back to some of the aspects that I've mentioned in the presentation. Most of the there are in the second phase of the free trade agreement between China and Pakistan, there are around 6,700 items that are duty-free that China exports to Pakistan, and there are a little more than 1,000 items that Pakistan exports to China duty-free. So here again, you can see that the trade imbalance and the relationship there, it's really it's quite not the same scale. And most of the items that the export consists of are, especially from Pakistan, are in the textile industry. So the idea was to sort of promote and give a boost to that particular aspect. So I think that potentially, yes, there is an element there to strengthen China's trading position in Europe, and it's something that we've seen. I mean, with Pakistan as well, but with China-EU relations in years, I think there is a potential to do a lot of comparative analysis between what's happening in Pakistan and what's happening in regarding China's approach, of course, to South Asia and Europe in general. And I think that's an excellent example.
Okay, thank you very much for response on the trade issue. I will come back to the trade issue later.
Okay.
And when it comes to, you mentioned the FTA, but this is before we discuss this issue, which I think is very important. We have a question from India, from USI,
okay.
From Rakesh Badaria. And here's a question in the context of the debt. How is the CPEC accentuating Pakistan's debt problem? Yeah, and if the CPEC is pushing Pakistan's debt problem. Perhaps you can also, this would be an extension from my side, perhaps refer also about the larger issue of debts and the IMF and World Bank but is the CPEC, I mean, the core issue is now here, is the CPEC pushing the debt problem in Pakistan?
I mean, some of what we've seen is that certainly, and this is something, first of all, thanks for the question. I think that one of the things that we've seen in recent years has been a twofold dimension. One has been the slowdown of the project, has been also because the PTI government was less keen to dive into agreements with on projects with China than the PMLN was. And some of the former PMLN officials went on record to say that some of these initiatives that the previous government took were a bit rushed, and they dived into this project without necessarily thinking this through too quickly. At the same time, one of the reasons why CPEC to an extent has slowed. So the debt problem, I think it's there, and I think it's something that it has been, of course, rejected by some of the official narrative. The discussion here, it's about how much of Pakistan debt it's to China, and I think that's according to some of the official figures that I've read, it's less than 10%. So there is a debt problem and a sustainability potential in the long run, but I think that it's a combination of factors that it's causing the Afghanistan economic corridor to sort of slow down, not least the IMF bailout of $6 billion, which was agreed the last year. So I think that's one of the things which is also crucial to understand the overall economy of CPEC going forward.
Thank you very much. We have another question again now from the SADF team. Albino Pras who's our office manager. You might also know him already. He's wondering about the huge amount of investments, money who goes into the CPEC. And in this context, I think you touched it a little bit. It goes more in the direction of the FTA. So he's wondering why this huge amount of money not reflected by the bilateral trade in of those countries, and how you see the arms trade issue in this. It seems that this is the biggest trade issue in this context. Also, how you relate the huge amount of money that goes in the CPEC project. How you explain the trade deficit, and how you see this the amount of arms in this context. So I mean trade and security dimension.
Okay, thanks for this very good question. I think part of the trade deficit, especially since 2013, can be in part explained by the export of machinery that is then deployed to develop and implement the CPEC projects, which was mostly coming from China to Pakistan. So that's one. That's one potential explanation. And in general, in terms of the financing of CPEC, the picture it's varied. There are some grants, there are some interest-free loans, and this is mostly what happens in Gwadar. There are some government concessional loans. So the picture it's quite varied on this sense. As far as the security dimension is concerned, I think China's constantly been one of the arms suppliers, one of the major arms suppliers to Pakistan. And whereas the US has been zooming in and out of the region for a number of years, I think what China has constantly done, and this is something which has emerged also from an analysis of the historical trend in the relationship, if you like, is that it sort of enabled constantly Pakistan to have the resources it needed to meet its own ends and its own goals. So I don't think that we should be particularly surprised by the security dimension and by the sort of nature and volume of the arms imports from China to Pakistan. I think that's, at times it has been higher, at times it has been a bit lower, but that has been something quite constant throughout the nearly 70 years of relationship between the two countries. So what is interesting, as I've mentioned before, is that the trade deficit really starts go up as soon as the sort of BRI projects are announced. And this reflects, again, increased volume of trade, but increased volume of imports in this trade. And most of these imports have been related to the China-Pakistan economic corridor.
Yes, very interesting. Thank you very much that you point this out. During my own research or my own observation on this issue of CPEC and FTA, I made similar observations. But I think this issue of FTA, it's very interesting because we didn't have the chance now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is such a complex topic. Because this issue is also linked with much of domestic criticism of CPEC. I mean, when you talk with local domestic entrepreneurs, not all are happy about the CPEC.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You find very often in the local press, in the statement of chambers, that they're talking about distortions, economic distortions, and that the Pakistani entrepreneurs have no chance to get a tender, to get involved. So how you see this, how far is CPEC producing economic inequalities in Pakistan? Yeah, I mean, there's the issue of Chinese workers, there's the issue of, this is a point which I make always when it comes to this FTA, that Pakistan has a little bit of an unfortunate economic trade policy by allowing all Chinese goods to come for free, more or less, or certain goods. So it helps China, of course. Well, there's no incentive for China to employ Pakistani companies in the project or to use much of in domestic materials. So how you see this? How far can Pakistani entrepreneurs benefit from the CPEC? And how much is it creating distortions?
I think that's a very good question, and I would concur with your point. And this is also something I think I've briefly mentioned. I mean, just if you look at the sheer number of products that are duty-free between Pakistan and China, one it's almost 7,000, the other one it's 1,000. So I think that's already a stark number, right? It gives a clear indication of where this is to an extent going. I think as far as opportunities are concerned, yes, you're absolutely right. There have been some reports and concerns expressed by chambers of commerce throughout the past few years. At the same time, my sense is that this, to an extent, are now being considered a little bit more. And there is there was a speech a talk by the Chinese ambassador, I think in February, so a couple of months ago, at the Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad, where he was essentially saying that as a result of the focus of the PTI government on a different set of projects and in making CPEC work for Pakistan as well in a way that it's different from what was done before, the focus will be more on joint ventures and to sort of create equal opportunities for both Chinese investors and Pakistani ones to cooperate in whether it's special economic zones or on more discrete and specific enterprises. So I think what your assessment is, I would concur with your assessment, and I think that probably this is something which we'll have to see how it pans out, but there are discussions that this is one of the core concerns. It might also reflect as well some of the interests, if you like, that are behind the governments in power. So of course, now those who were left out by the PMLN in the implementation of CPEC now, express their concerns. And now they have the chance to be part of it as well. So I think there is also an element of interest groups behind those in power who plays a role here.
Okay. The next question comes, I guess, also from India. We have a retired, or at least from South Asia, we have a question from a retired senior officer from the Armed Forces. And of course, first of all, thank you very much to your presentation.
Thank you.
But here's the question. This person would be delighted to hear from you your thoughts on the legality and ethical aspects of the Belt and Road at the macro level, and when sovereignty issues in the CPEC has been disregarded. So I guess sovereignty and legality, and I guess also refers a bit on the disputed area topic issue.
I'm not sure what the legality of the BRI.
I guess, yeah, that's how the question is formulated. Yeah, I guess this refers perhaps partly to the question on when parts of the BRI or CPEC in this context is built, constructed on disputed territory.
Okay, so
and the ethical aspects, yeah, this is a very broad issue, I think. So.
Yeah, it's I'll probably I don't know. I think that there are also the BRI. It's so broad that it's difficult to give a general assessment. It would end up in being a general discussion. I think on the sovereignty issue, that's something which has been there. One of the aspects that India has been very vocal about, has been extremely forceful in making clear what its stance is as far as the China-Pakistan economic corridor is concerned. And I think what India was successful to an extent in doing was to sort of make this its position and make it very well heard, especially in the United States. So I think that's one of the areas where, and the fact that India is still not part of the Belt and Road Initiative, I think it's a clear testament to their concerns with regards to sovereignty and the China-Pakistan economic corridor. I'm not sure. And again, the question is very broad. I think this is, if there is anything a bit more specific, I'd be happy to discuss it, but I think that's...
Yeah, perhaps a participant can get a little bit more concrete in this direction. Perhaps from my perspective, I mean, I partly touched this issue also in my own work when it comes to legality. I mean, it's really good questions, but as you mentioned, it's very broad. It touches also, I think, from my perspective, questions of when it comes to local ownership in decision making, for example. Yeah, this is not the only question which is asked which appears in Pakistan, but also in other countries. When we can draw this question to the fact, to the link to the way how China is negotiating certain projects. So there is the key word of this Mahmoudi and the elite level, yeah, and that locals like in Balochistan or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, they always complain or makes a point that they are all not asked when the major decisions are done. You mentioned in your introduction, we had 2015 the official launch of the CPEC, yeah, but most of the largest early harvest projects were already done in 2013, more or less behind closed doors. At that point, most of the people in Pakistan never heard about something like CPEC. Yeah? So, but many contracts and MOUs were already done.
Yeah.
So this is an issue which we also can observe in many other countries along the Belt and Road. So the question of how to incorporate the locals, yeah, how to improve local ownership in certain Belt and Road projects or in all later Belt and Road projects. So this is, I don't know if you have a different perspective. How is your
No, I think I would agree with you.
This is a general problem.
I would agree with you, and this is something which, to an extent, I mean, this is something which comes up also in my recent work on the federal dimension as well. It's clear that up until I think the fifth JCC, Joint Cooperation Committee meeting, for instance, the provincial chief ministers were not included in the decision-making process. And so I think that's what also caused a lot of resentment and discussion within Pakistan as to what this is, to what's the rationale behind developing CPEC as it's currently being developed is. At the same time, my sense is that now this is something which is being, to an extent, addressed. And I don't know how far this initiative, but there is a general sense that this is something which it's going to make or break really what happens with the BRI. So there is a growing realization that local ownership is something which matters and will matter more and more. So in the first phase, I think especially between 2013 and 2016, because I think in the JCC of end of 2016 is the first time in which chief ministers were invited. And I think that was an issue. That was clearly an issue, and that's what raised all the root controversy, whether it's East and Western, and which is to an extent still ongoing.
Yeah, we have another question from the SAF team, Deshika Lapata. She is touching again the question of which you highlighted in your presentation, the issue of Afghanistan, the potential extension of the CPEC towards Afghanistan. Here her question is, how likely it would be when, just in case Pakistan would change certain policy patterns due to the good relation with China, how likely it would be that Afghanistan could be still included into the CPEC in case there would be change in certain policies?
Well, I think, when and if, it's a big if, the political will starts really being there to get Afghanistan on board, I think then there would be the question on the security of developing projects in Afghanistan. So I think it's also a matter of security, it's a matter of stability within the country for economic corridors to produce the desired results. What we've seen, I think the Pakistan experience in sort of providing security has been, we've seen a dramatic drop in attacks and terrorist violence within Pakistan in 2013. So when the CPEC started, I mean, the numbers were huge. Up to now in this year, the numbers are very little. So I think in that sense, that's one of the preconditions. And unless you can guarantee the security of workers and of projects and of construction, then it becomes difficult to envisage the inclusion of Afghanistan. So I mean, I think ideally that's the ideal scenario, especially true to the original vision for CPEC and for the economic corridor. So to be a bridge for China to the Gulf, but also for Pakistan to Central Asia to an extent, which would necessarily go through Afghanistan. As the current circumstances, as the present situation is, I'm not entirely sure that that's likely, at least in the short term.
Mm.
Sorry,
actually, yeah.
It's not a very optimistic take, but I'm afraid that's...
Actually, Jessica opens an interesting topic in this context, which is very crucial for all economic corridors when we are getting back to this idea of an economic corridor, because it's really, we have to be aware when we're talking about China-Pakistan economic corridor, we have to be again aware what are the crucial features of an economic corridor. We have 2 points. You know? One point is this, which we can call external connectivity. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is of utmost importance to open up an economic corridor to other corridors or about the Pakistan-China borders to get the maximum benefit out of it. This is one of the points to have a successful corridor. The second point is, perhaps we can talk later about it, about the industrialization. Yeah? Otherwise, when you don't have external connectivity, when an economic corridor does not lead to the modernization and industrialization of a country or of the area of an economic corridor, it's something else. Yeah, we can talk about energy corridor, we can talk about transport corridor, production chain corridor, but it's not an economic corridor. So just to sum up at least one part, which we did already with Afghanistan, but partly we touched India. How do you see the opportunity at the moment, or let's say before coronavirus came into the picture? How do you measure the chances of the CPEC to open up beyond the Pakistan border in order to gain maximum benefit out of this development machine?
I think that's a very good question. I think that so far there's a lot of discussion about special economic zones, right? Especially in the second phase of CPEC. What my understanding is that so far only one has been agreed on, and the one is in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, so it's in KP. And so I think on that side, and the industrial cooperation, it's the very heart of. It's at the very heart of the second phase of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So unless that happens, but I think it has to be, and it goes back to the point that I was making before, I think it has to be simultaneous with, a sort of political consideration about, once you have developed these industries, how well these industries then get integrated in the regional connectivity. About the point you were saying also about the external dimension of economic corridors and the external development. So how do you link all this up in a region which is quite fragmented from an economic and political perspective as well? So I think that's the first issue. In terms of the opening up, I think there were discussions about Saudi Arabia investing or opening up an oil refinery in Gwadar, in Balochistan. I think that, so far it's been mainly a Pakistan-China. And if some of these projects then deliver on the benefits that are expected, then we are probably likely to see some few other investors coming in. Saudi Arabia might be one. I think we've seen some joint ventures, especially in the implementation of the CPEC project with some Turkish companies. I think that's also another area which is potentially worth looking at. Yeah, I think that there is some opening up, probably not, as open as one would expect it to be.
So we have a clarification from our senior officer.
Yeah.
In India. So I think, yeah, this is a very excellent question. I mean, he refers now again to the larger context of funding. And so when we see the funding of the CPEC of the project, which we discussed before, so how this will impact the approach of other countries which are involved in the pre-context? So do you see a trend towards renegotiations of contracts and to improve the financial conditions? What is your observation in this direction?
I think that's a very good question, and I think it's difficult to portray an even picture across the board because we've seen different experiences in different countries. I think for Malaysia, it was an example which made the headlines, and it was in a way able to renegotiate some of the terms that were originally agreed with China. When we've seen with Pakistan, I'm not sure that the renegotiation was really, I mean, there were some attempts, especially by the from the PTI government to try and renegotiate, or not renegotiate, but reconsider some of this. And the fact that some of that no new mega projects have been added to the China-Pakistan economic corridor, I think also reflects in a way the difficulties in agreeing on terms of financing which would have be perceived beneficial to both sides of the story. So I think that's indeed an interesting area. So if on the one hand we see the Malaysia example where there was a successful, in a way, renegotiation, when it comes to Pakistan, I think that was less successful, and they instead opted for focusing a little bit more on along the lines of the political agenda that the government in power had. So the PTI focused, they campaigned extensively on a very populist social welfare kind of agenda, and that's in a way being met by some of the projects that are being agreed now for the second phase of CPEC. So I think that's it's a very interesting question, and it would be interesting to assess it even more comparatively by looking at other cases of what other countries have been able to do as far as this is concerned. I've just mentioned two examples, different ones, as I think, I mean, there are, I think, more than 65 countries now which are part of the BRI. So it would be interesting to look at this more comparatively as well.
Yes, thank you very much for this clarification. I think we had until now a very excellent overview about issues regarding the external connectivity of CPEC, and also you touched the issue of the need for industrialization and how it might proceed, even set the focus more on the pre-corona context. So this gives me now the incentive to ask the $1 million question. So since we are now we are observing and experiencing a very difficult time also in Pakistan, and a very difficult, challenging question to assess projects like the CPEC. But how do you see the potential impact of Corona on the CPEC development? And referring now to leading newspaper articles of the last days, weeks, or let's say days, how much could be this a challenge for so-called iron friendship and relation between all-weather friendship between Pakistan and China? Because we know, and we mentioned that this, 2-3 times, that the relationship is on the peak, but this means not that there are no clouds on the sky.
Yeah.
And we had several up and downs in the bilateral relation between the two countries. A lot of different expectations, which got matched or not, or matched partly. So how you see this now? Could this Corona situation create fissures in the bilateral relations? And in particular, focus now, of course, on the CPEC.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I think on the wider. Okay, so I'll probably contradict myself a little bit, but no. When I was saying about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which has become a bit, it's impossible now to decouple it from China-Pakistan relations. I think it would be important now to sort of make that distinction as well, and to sort of look at it as two different layers. One, I'm not sure that Sino-Pakistani relations are going to get particularly affected by the coronavirus crisis. We've seen the visit, as I've mentioned in the conclusions, the visit by the Pakistani president to China. I think it's a clear indication of the desire, and that Pakistan had to show solidarity with China. It was the second foreign leader to visit China during this pandemic, so it was really, and the first one, I think, was either the prime minister or the president of Cambodia. So it was, it was a clear sign that, the so-called old water friendship, it's very much there, and it's there to stay. So on that note, I'm not sure that there is going to be much, especially if then the visit of President Xi Jinping to Pakistan this year materializes, whether it's later this year or it's early next year. Regardless, I think that can be to some extent impacted. It's the Pakistan economic corridor for a very obvious reason, if you like, is now probably China, as a result, to come out of lockdown, will probably have to focus on domestic consumption. So they will probably more inward focus than outward focus. And this is probably going to affect the financing of the second phase of the China-Pakistan economic corridor to a certain extent. It's difficult to tell now the extent to which this is going to have an impact, but I think it probably will have repercussions on the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Not so much on what's already on the ground. It was, I read in the news that there were the Chinese workers, I think at the beginning of April, some Chinese workers on CPEC projects were already going back to Pakistan, and after 2 weeks of quarantine, they would have gone back to work. So I think that it's not a matter of what of the 2 million roughly you see already there. It's probably something which is gonna hit the second and going ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I would just have one last, since we don't have any more at the moment, at least questions from our participants. One question more. We talked much about civil-military relations, and which is, of course, you can't talk about Pakistan. It's not talking about civil-military relations. But I want to stay in the context of the Corona crisis. As we know, many of us know that Pakistan has the civilian governments in Pakistan. They don't have much positive record when it comes to dealing with crisis situation. Doesn't matter if it's earthquake, if it's flooding. Now with Corona, we had always a situation that the military had to come in for civilian aid missions. I mean, this is not a situation which is particular special to Pakistan. We have also in Europe that here and there, in some cases, the army is called in for some support. This is in Germany during the flooding several years ago in the 90s, or is this now in Italy with the army who gives support. But the frequency and the large-scale interventions and of the military to manage initial civilian tasks it's a boring decree. So how you see the performance of the current government of Prime Minister Imran Khan in this context, how he is managing the situation, and how much this could affect the civil-military relations in particular?
I mean, as far as the coronavirus crisis is concerned, I think it's still relatively early days to assess, but what we can say is that overall the trend has been a trend civilian control, yes, that I would argue during the PMLN government, at least to an extent, were under civilian control. I think that as also I've tried to sketch out in the presentation, I think that's something which it's being taken almost completely away from elected officials. The CPEC authority, it's an excellent of this, I think, as it is the National Development Council, which in its remit and in its rules and regulations has also the idea of, discussing about regional connectivity, and among other members, of course, most of it are civilian. There is also the Chief of Army Staff. So de facto, the student bodies are at the very heart of what's going on now in Pakistan, and they have given an institutional role and taken the decision-making process. This is to the military, and this is it's overt. Okay, so I think it's very clear, and these are clear indications that at least in these areas, civilian control it's being diluted clearly from the previous stint. So the assessment is overall, I mean, what I've done in the book, I've scored each of the areas in, with high, medium, and low levels of civilian control. And so if we were to do something size applied to the last couple of years, I think they would score as low levels of civilian control without any particular doubt. I don't know if you... Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, we could talk now much more longer about this issue, but since we are getting now close to the end of our available time for the webinar, I want to use this occasion to express my thank you to you for your excellent presentation, and also for this insightful Q&A session. Here, I want to express my gratitude particularly also to our participants who are coming from all over. I'm still heard? I'm still heard? I'm still here? Do we have a connection? Hello? So I'm not sure if I'm still there. Are we already here? Filippo, can you hear me?
Okay.
We had a technical short
I
interruption.
can hear you.
Yeah, everybody here. So I just want to say thank you again to your excellent, wonderful presentation. We covered so many different topics, from bilateral relations with China, Pakistan, other neighboring countries. We talked about democracy issues. We talked about sovereignty issues. We talked about economic challenging issues regarding CPEC and overall economy in the context of the corona. Thank you very much for this. I want to say also thank you to our participants, which are coming not only from Europe, from Brussels. We have representatives from Brussels think tanks, from the political community, the decision maker community. We have also several participants from Pakistan, also from India. My gratitude is this, that you take part in our session today, and I hope we will see us all soon again, perhaps on May 6th, when we are talking about India-China relation with Faisal Difsi from Oxford University. Until then, I wish you a wonderful, nice afternoon, and as we all say, stay safe and at home, perhaps. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Siegfried, and thanks, participants. Sorry, my internet connection is probably a bit slow, so I don't know if barely.